Is it possible that Bigfoot, Goatmen, and the Michigan Dogman are examples of modern lycanthropy?
Wow. Well, for the sake of our studio audience, lycanthropy is, of course, the art and state of being a werewolf. Although, of course, you can extend it further to include other kinds of shapeshifting, where jaguars, where foxes, every culture has its own stories of shapeshifters, werebears. Um, that is a very good question. It also begs certain other questions. Of course, first is, do any of these things exist? Now, I've never been a werewolf. I never hope to be one, but I can tell you this right now, I'd rather see than be one. Well, never mind. But the traditional folklore on werewolves, which is, again, like most folklore, very similar in broad strokes, but very different from region to region, if that makes sense, and then smaller things. Is a person who either willingly or unwillingly is transformed into an animal, usually a wolf, in our culture anyway, either through some evil desire of his own or a curse placed upon him by someone else. We're all familiar, if we like old movies, with that wonderful rhyme by Uspensky in The Werewolf of London. Even a man who is pure at heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blows and the moon is full and bright. Now, I personally don't know whether or not that actually happens. I would also have to say I don't know that it doesn't. And that's kind of an important thing to understand. It is, as I say, a universal motif in the world's folklore. Now, whether that's the case because of some deep Jungian psychological thing, or whether because somehow or how that happens, I'm not the one to say. I don't know. But presuming for a moment the possibility, and again, it's easier to prove a possibility than an impossibility. Because if something is impossible, it's never happened. According to Christian folklore, the werewolf was in a sense a mockery by the devil of the incarnation. Rather than God into man, man into animal. They saw vampires in the same way. The resurrection of Christ being life in death, and the vampire, of course, being death in life. The devil is the ape of God. So that was the theological explanation that various authorities back in the day when people believed in such things attributed to it. Now, the question he raises about Bigfoot and Yeti and all that kind of phenomenon of cryptozoology. There's a word for it, cryptozoology.
Wow.
The animals being studied, by the way, are called cryptids, just so you know.
Okay.
Everything from the Loch Ness Monster to Bigfoot to, also faux dinosaurs, all kinds of things. Big cats in places where they shouldn't be. Cougars in England, that kind of thing. Again, lots of legends from around the world about these kinds of things. Some, of course, affect to see in them a survival, perhaps, of another sort of hominid, Neanderthal man or something like that. Others will point out the fact that they're easy to see and difficult to get any physical evidence from. Although they found footprints, they found excrement, they found hair samples, they found all sorts of things. So again, as with the question of lycanthropy, so too you've got a big fat if these exist. Then comes the question, if either or both of these phenomena exist, is there a connection between them? That is a very good question, and frankly, not one I had ever considered until this moment. But it would explain, if it were true, why we don't find Bigfoot camps, why they don't seem to be a permanent population.
Well, what immediately comes to my mind is in your friend William Biersack's novel, The Darkness Did Not, he seemed to imply that the vampire mythology is rooted in real life happenings, as in they're demon-possessed corpses.
Correct.
And this actually happened, and it turned into the vampire thing.
Well, yeah, and there's a big prehistory to these things. I mean, in the case of the vampire, for instance, in the Balkans, especially in those areas controlled by the Austrians in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were a number of rashes of these sorts of affairs. And the officials who dealt with them write them up in this dull, officialese German, in the same tone that they'd talk about ordering pens or paper. You know, this day investigated the cemetery at Oglutch. 6 of the recently deceased were found to be filled with blood, supple. When staked, they gave out screams. But again, very like a bureaucrat writing about a vampire affair. Now, again, it's very difficult for us to believe that such things can happen, and easier to prove that but it's harder to prove that they can't than that they can. It's certainly not within the experience of most of us, and there may be, if such things exist, there may be many explanations as to why. Biddle's explanation is, of course, the vampire folklore, which is, it doesn't have a particle of its personality remaining. It is, as you say, literally a demon-possessed corpse. So the question is, if demons can possess the living, can they possess the dead? And what would be the physiology of that? How would they keep them going?
Yeah.
I have to give, as I think anyone who's either A, sane, or B, hasn't encountered anything of this sort, or C, both, I have to say at the end of the day, I don't know. It's not a matter of dogma.
There's no historical sort of explanation or examples or anecdotal evidence
Sure.
of werewolves?
Sure, absolutely. In France in the 17th century, the 16th century, in the Balkans. But see, again, here's the problem. When you look at those records, all right, we're faced with a huge gulf between who we are and who they are. They write down these happenings and say this is what happened. We, convinced that they can't, read them and immediately begin looking for some other kind of explanation.
Mm.
What we're incapable of doing is suspending judgment. We say, since that can't happen, they were wrong. Well, I think, honestly, it's best to keep an open mind. The fact that there were historical accounts of these things, anecdotes of these things, and the fact that all sorts of peculiar and strange things go on today and simply fall by the wayside. And it's best to suspend judgment. I think you would be, again, unless you had some personal experience, which is a different story. In that case, please come forward. Although you might argue that they often do on coast to coast, so that blows that right there. But it would be, I think, extremely advised to say these things absolutely happen, but just as advised to say they can't.
I saw a documentary some years back of 2 brothers, I think it was in South America, and they had a disorder, and they essentially looked like Chewbacca from Star Wars.
Yep, absolutely.
And so that, to me, that opens the door for...
Well, yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of, there are people born with tails. As I say, to say it can't happen is foolish. To say it absolutely positively happens is almost as foolish. To be assured that you have the absolute reason and know all about it, that's the most foolish of the bunch. Because, as you say, perhaps there were birth defects involved, perhaps there was this, perhaps there was that. We can't know. And so I think that the healthiest point of view in all these things is to keep an open mind and a good collection of holy water.
Okay, good advice.